I found the insurance policy 3 days after the funeral. Not his insurance policy. Mine. Taken out in my name, with him listed as the sole beneficiary, dated 4 months before we got engaged. I was sitting on the floor of our home office at 2 in the morning with a glass of water going warm beside me, and a paper cut on my index finger from the edge of the folder he had labeled, in his careful handwriting, household documents. I read it twice. Then I sat very still for a long time, the way you go still when your body understands something before your mind is ready to say it out loud. My name is Claire Ashworth. I am 36 years old. I am a financial analyst in Charleston, South Carolina, and I have been very good at reading numbers my entire professional life. What I was not good at, for longer than I want to admit, was reading people who had decided I was a number worth calculating. This is the story of a man who married me for what I had, and how I made sure he left with nothing he planned for. I grew up in Mount Pleasant, just across the bridge from Charleston, in a house that always smelled like cedar and old paper because my grandfather had been a collector of antique maps. He left that collection to my mother when he died. She left it to me when she passed the summer I turned 27, along with the house, a portfolio of quietly managed investments, and a trust that had been building since before I was born. I did not come from flashy money. We did not take extravagant vacations or drive cars that announced themselves. But the money was there, solid and deep, the kind that does not disappear in bad markets because it was never chasing trends to begin with. I was not the kind of woman who led with any of that. I had learned early, from watching my mother, that the wrong kind of attention follows wealth the way humidity follows August in South Carolina. You feel it before you can name it. So I lived modestly. I drove a 7-year-old Volvo. I kept my office lunch modest. I dressed well but not expensively. To most people who met me, I was simply a careful, competent woman who was good at her job and kept her personal life quiet. That was how I thought I had met Daniel. We were introduced at a colleague's dinner party in the spring 3 years ago now. He was sitting at the far end of the table when I arrived, dark-haired, easy in the way some men are easy, the kind of person who fills a room without seeming to try. He was a structural engineer, or said he was. He asked good questions. He listened when I answered, which already put him ahead of most people I had dated. He laughed at the right moments and did not talk over me once all evening. On the drive home, my friend Patrice, who had been watching him from across the table all night, said, "He spent more time looking at you than he did at his food." I told her that was probably nothing. She said, "Claire, that man was studying you." I remember laughing at the word she chose. Studying. Like she had said it wrong. I should have held on to that word longer. We dated for 7 months before he proposed. Looking back now, I can see the architecture of it clearly. The way he established closeness fast, 3 dates in the first 2 weeks, always his idea, always well planned, always somewhere that required me to feel slightly seen. The flowers sent to my office after our second date, which made my coworkers raise their eyebrows in a way that felt like collective approval. The way he met my grief about my mother head-on, asking real questions about her, sitting with me through the answers without trying to pivot the conversation back to himself. He was extraordinarily good at making me feel that my inner life mattered to him. The first thing that should have stopped me was a comment he made about 6 weeks in. We were walking along the waterfront, and I mentioned offhandedly that I was having the house on Rutledge Avenue assessed for some foundation work. He stopped walking, just for a second. Then he kept going and said, "The house on Rutledge?" His voice was calibrated so carefully it almost sounded like curiosity. Almost. I told him it had been my mother's. He said, "That neighborhood has held its value remarkably well." Not, "I would love to see where you grew up someday." Not, "It must mean a lot to you to have kept it." The value. That was the word he reached for first. I filed it somewhere in the back of my mind and kept walking. The second thing came from his friend Marcus, who I met over drinks 4 months into dating Daniel. Marcus was louder than Daniel, less careful, the kind of person who says more than he means to when the second drink arrives. He clapped Daniel on the back at the bar and said, in the tone of an inside joke I was not meant to catch, "You always did know how to find the ones worth finding." Daniel laughed and changed the subject in about 4 seconds flat. I smiled like I had not heard it clearly, but I had heard every word. I almost said something later that night. We were in the car, and I could feel the sentence forming in my mouth, something like, "What did Marcus mean by that?" But Daniel reached over just then and turned the radio down and said, "I've been thinking about where this is going. With us. And I think I want it to go somewhere real." And just like that, the other sentence disappeared. That is how it works when someone is skilled at it. They learn your hesitations and they step into them before you can speak. He proposed at my mother's house. That detail did not feel manipulative then. It felt like he understood what mattered to me. He got down on one knee in the garden where she used to grow tomatoes and said the right words in the right order with the right amount of emotion in his voice. I said yes with tears on my face and my hands shaking. And the whole time some quiet part of me felt like the luckiest woman alive. We set the wedding for the following spring. The first year of our marriage was not unhappy exactly. But it was the kind of not unhappy that requires constant maintenance, the way a beautiful old house requires maintenance, always something shifting underneath that you are not quite ready to look at directly. Daniel was attentive but on his own schedule. Warm when he needed something, distant when he did not. He started bringing up the investment portfolio more often, asking questions that he framed as partnership and planning but that always landed in the same place. How accessible was it? Who managed it? What it would take to consolidate our finances more completely. I had a financial advisor named Ruth who I had worked with since before my mother died. She was 61 years old, direct, completely unbothered by charm, and the kind of woman who said what she meant even when it was inconvenient. In our first meeting after the wedding, when I mentioned that Daniel had suggested we move everything into a joint account structure, she looked at me over her glasses for a moment and said, "What does he bring to a joint structure?" I told her he earned a good salary. She said, "That is not what I asked." I left that meeting feeling vaguely defensive on his behalf. Now I understand that Ruth had seen the shape of it from the outside almost immediately. I started noticing small things that I kept explaining away. He knew my account numbers before I had told him. He had met with a private banker at my institution, the one I had been working with for years, for what he described as a casual conversation about financial planning for couples. The banker, to his credit, had called me afterward to ask if I had authorized the meeting. I had not. Daniel said he had just been doing research, that he wanted to understand our full picture, that he was trying to be a good partner. The word he used so often, partner. He started a business the second year of our marriage. A development consulting firm, he called it, which was vague enough that I had to ask several questions to understand what it was actually supposed to do. He needed startup capital, not a lot, he said, just enough to get the infrastructure in place, $80,000 to start. He asked if we could use joint funds. We did not have true joint funds yet because I had held that boundary with Ruth, but we did have a household account I contributed to monthly. He had been pulling from it in ways I had not been watching closely. I agreed to the $80,000 because I believed him. Or I told myself I did. The business produced nothing visible for 8 months. No clients that I could verify. No contracts he would show me. Meetings that he described in general terms and could not follow up with specifics when I asked later. I started checking more carefully. I started saving his explanations in my phone, writing down dates and details, the way you do when you are not ready to say why but some part of you already knows. That was when my friend Patrice came to me. We had lunch on a Tuesday, which was unusual for a workday. She had asked me specifically and said she had something she needed to show me in person. I remember she ordered coffee and then did not drink it. She had a printout in her bag that she slid across the table without saying anything first. It was a screenshot of a message board I had never heard of, a private forum for a certain kind of man who believed there was a strategy to marrying money. The post had been made under a username I did not recognize, but the details inside it were specific enough to make my hands go cold. The post described a woman, a financial analyst, recently inherited significant property and a trust, based in Charleston, divorced from any close family, emotionally available because of a recent loss. It described her personality, her apartment before she moved to the Rutledge house, her daily routines, her workplace, the dinner party where she had first been approached. It had been written nearly 4 years ago. Before we met, I read it twice sitting at that lunch table. Then I folded it carefully and put it in my own bag. Patrice was watching my face. She said, "I found it 3 weeks ago and I did not know how to tell you." I told her she had done the right thing. My voice was completely steady. My coffee cup was rattling slightly against the saucer because my hand was shaking and I had not noticed. I put both hands in my lap. I said, "Does anyone else know?" She said no. I said, "Keep it that way for now." I drove home in 23 minutes and walked through my own front door, and stood in the hallway of my mother's house with my coat still on. The cedar and old paper smell was still there. underneath everything else. And I thought about my grandfather, who had collected maps his whole life, who had told me once that the most important thing about any map was not the destination but the routes you could see that the traveler had not considered. Then I went upstairs, changed out of my work clothes, made dinner, and waited for Daniel to come home. He kissed me on the cheek when he came in. He said dinner smelled great. He asked about my day. I smiled and answered him, and the whole time, something in me had already started moving. I called Ruth the next morning from my car before I went into my office. I told her everything. She was quiet for longer than Ruth was usually quiet, and then she said, "How quickly do you want to move?" I told her I needed to understand the full damage first. She said she would make calls that afternoon. By the end of the week, I had a meeting scheduled with a matrimonial attorney named Susan Park, who had an office downtown and a reputation for being, as her assistant put it when I asked, extremely thorough. Susan was small and still and had the kind of face that gave nothing away while taking everything in. In our first meeting, I put the printout on her desk, along with a timeline I had written up that documented every financial request Daniel had made in the 2 years of our marriage, every vague explanation, every amount I could trace. She read through it without interrupting and then said, "What outcome do you want?" I told her I wanted to leave this marriage with everything I came into it with and nothing he had touched. She said, "That is achievable." Over the next 10 weeks, I moved with the kind of precision I had spent my entire career learning. Ruth restructured the portfolio so that nothing accessible sat in anything Daniel could reach. The Rutledge house had never been put in joint title because Susan, reviewing our original marriage documents, found that the deed transfer Daniel had suggested in year 1 had never actually been completed, a clerical issue, he had said at the time. Now I understood it had not been a clerical issue at all. He had been working on it. He had simply not finished in time. The $80,000 from the household account was documented, traced, and legally designated as a loan in arrears by Susan's office after a careful review of the original conversation, which I had, it turned out, in writing in an email thread he had forgotten I still had access to. He had used the word loan himself. Once was enough. I did not confront Daniel. I did not cry in front of him. I did not give him a single moment that allowed him to recalibrate. I cooked dinner and asked about his day and sat beside him at the table every night for 10 weeks while the structure beneath his plan was removed piece by piece, the way you take apart a load-bearing wall only after you have already reinforced everything around it. He found out the morning I filed. Not because I told him. Because his banker, the private one he had cultivated at my institution, called to inform him that his access request on a secondary account had been declined. He came into the kitchen where I was standing with my coffee, and his face was doing something I had never seen it do before. The careful arrangement of it had come apart. He looked like a man who had walked through a door and found a room he had not expected on the other side. He said, "What did you do?" Not a question. A statement, which told me everything about what he knew he had been doing. I told him I had spoken with my attorney. I told him the papers had been filed that morning. I told him that a detailed account of his financial conduct during the marriage, including the post I had found, had been shared with Susan and documented as part of the proceedings. I told him the $80,000 would be recovered, and that any claim he intended to make on the trust or property had been reviewed by 3 separate legal professionals who were confident it would not succeed. He started to speak. I let him get about 4 seconds in and then I said, "You researched me before we ever met. You planned the introduction. You found the dinner party. You sat across from a grieving woman and decided what she was worth." My voice did not shake at all. I had not known it would be so steady until that moment. "The only thing you miscalculated was that I have spent my entire career understanding exactly how money moves and where it goes when someone is trying to move it quietly." He went through anger and then through something that looked almost like negotiation, and then through a silence that was more honest than anything he had said to me in 3 years. I told him I had arranged for his things to be collected by end of week. I told him the locks would be changed the following Monday. Then I finished my coffee and I picked up my bag and I walked out of my mother's house and drove to my office. My hands were shaking again on the steering wheel. Not from fear this time. From the specific exhaustion that comes when you have been holding something enormous for a very long time and you finally put it down. The divorce was settled in 5 months. Daniel made claims that went nowhere because Susan had made sure there was nowhere for them to go. The business he had started with my money dissolved within weeks of the filing, which told me more about what it had actually been than any explanation he ever offered. He left Charleston not long after. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he had moved north. I did not ask for details. Patrice came over the first Saturday after the locks were changed. She brought takeout and her dog and did not say a single version of "I told you so," which is the truest kind of friendship. We sat in the garden where Daniel had proposed and ate noodles out of containers, and at some point she looked at me and said, "How are you actually doing?" I thought about it honestly for a moment. Then I said, "I feel like I got my house back." She understood exactly what I meant. Ruth and I met the following month to review everything. She put the portfolio summary on the desk between us and said, in that same direct voice she always used, "It is intact. Everything he touched has been untangled. You lost 2 years and $80,000 that will be recovered." She paused. "You did not lose the house." She looked at me the way she sometimes did, like she was deciding whether to say something. Then she said, "Your mother would have liked how you handled it." I had to look out the window for a minute after that. I still live in the house on Rutledge Avenue. The cedar smell is still there in the mornings when the windows are closed. My grandfather's maps are in the hall, in the same frames my mother chose for them. I had the garden replanted last spring, different flowers now, something my mother had always meant to do but never got around to. I think about what made me vulnerable to Daniel and I try to be honest with myself about it. Grief had opened something in me that I did not know how to protect. The loss of my mother had left a quiet in the house that I filled too fast with someone who had studied exactly how to fit inside it. That is not my fault. It is also not a reason to be careless again. What I know now that I did not know then is that people who want what you have will always work harder to seem safe than people who actually are. The performance of trustworthiness is more practiced and more detailed than the real thing. The real thing is quieter. It does not explain itself as often. It does not show up quite so perfectly on schedule. And when you are uncertain, when something feels like it fits too well, it is worth asking not just what someone is giving you, but what they are positioned to receive. Daniel bet that I was too trusting, too softened by loss, too inexperienced with that specific kind of dishonesty to see clearly until it was too late. He was almost right. Almost is where the whole story turns. I did not get justice by being louder than him or angrier or more dramatic. I got it by being patient, methodical, and very, very good at the thing I had spent my entire career doing. He chose a financial analyst to deceive about money. I sometimes think if he had known me more honestly instead of studying me from a distance, he might have understood what a specific mistake that was. The house is mine. The trust is intact. The garden is blooming with things my mother would have chosen herself. And the man who planned this down to the dinner party, he arranged to meet me at left with nothing he came for. Some math is simple even when it takes time to work out. You cannot build a life on someone else's foundation and expect the numbers to hold.